With a lot of the shakeups to the meta, there are still 5 agents in Valorant that are underpowered compared to the rest of the roster. These characters have really low pick and win rate and could really use some big buffs from Daddy Riot. So wasting no more time, we're going to jump into the #1 agent that needs big buffs, and that's Deadlock. Now, Deadlock is the newest agent on the block and also the only agent that saw a 0% pick rate in Valorant Champion. While some people might initially think that this is just because the character is new and there's not enough testing for top teams, as players have gotten more and more used to Deadlock, people have realized just how underpowered she is. Even new characters with after testing ended up not becoming staples in the meta still saw far more play than Deadlock has, and this character has been completely written off and disregarded in both the pro and the ranked communities alike. Now, that being said, what exactly is Deadlock's specific problem that needs to be solved? And it really comes down to an inconsistency in the value that you get out of her abilities. Sonic Sensor gives you information, but there are many other abilities that do that better. GravNet can still allow the enemy to shoot you even if they're slowed and crouched, so you could literally just straight up die even if they're in it. Barrier Mesh is probably her most powerful ability, but there are certain situations where it just doesn't do anything, and then certain situations where it's great, creating that inconsistency I talked about. And while the Ultimate Annihilation can be good legitimately, it's not as powerful or round changing as some other ultimates, especially when we compare it to another Sentinel ultimate like Killjoy's ult. It just really falls flat. So I think there's a couple of ways that you could really buff this character. #1, you can make everything last longer and be cheaper. I mean, just buffing the numbers of things make things better, and eventually you do that to a point it becomes strong enough, right? You could do that hypothetically. Like, you take an ultimate that takes maybe 7 points to get, and it's a bad ultimate, right? But then you make it 6, and then 5, and then maybe 4, and eventually at some point it becomes ridiculous, and sometimes it can become too strong. And while I think you could definitely push her in this direction with a lot of her abilities, I think it would probably be better to rework some of the abilities or add extra utility to them. Change some stuff up about GravNet and Sonic Sensor to make these more powerful abilities. Add some extra effects to these abilities to make them more valuable, and just add some more consistency to this character's kit overall. Right now, she's the worst character in the game by far, so I think they could be a bit dramatic with the buffs that they put onto Deadlock, but definitely let me know down below, how would you buff Deadlock if it was up to you? Now, the next character that Riot needs to buff might really surprise you, but before we get into that, check out SkillCapped.com, where we have updated guides on Reyna, Jet, Brimstone, Yoru, Harbor, Gecko, Deadlock, Kayo, and more. So if you really want to better your gameplay and become a top tier player as quickly as possible, check it out right now in the links down below. Now, the #2 agent is Sage, and if you're a little bit curious about why Sage needs buffs, in Valorant Champions, this character was only picked a 1% of the time, and honestly, in both ranked and pro play, coordinated play, and anything in between alike, Sage has been often carried not by her power level, but by her popularity. People like Sage and like this character, but really, the numbers don't lie. She is very, very weak right now, and the biggest reason is that she really only has one map where she's good in, and that map is Icebox, which is not in the map pool. And without Icebox being in the map pool, and I don't really think that there's anything wrong with the Sage meta. I think most people would actually prefer a Sage meta to something like a Killjoy meta, just from gameplay alone. While you do have slow and you slow down an engagement as a Sentinel, I think it's a little bit of a less abrasive disruption than like Killjoy Mollies and Killjoy Turret. Regardless though, Sage has been the target for more nerfs than probably any character in this game since her launch. At the very start of the game, Sage was one of the best agents, period, and it feels like every single year that goes by, they make her weaker and weaker and weaker, and I think that you could probably buff certain aspects of her kit, make her a bit better. Resurrection is 8 points, maybe you could turn it down to 7. Healing Orb is not as good on yourself. Honestly, I think that you could probably enable it to heal yourself fully now as well. I understand that they wanted to make it so that the Healing Orb gets more value on your teammates, but I did actually like the flexibility of being able to use it on yourself as well and still get legitimate value. You could also do things like buff the barrier orbs, fortify, so it gets fortified a little bit quicker, or you could make slow orb a bit cheaper if you wanted to by 50 credits or something like that. The goal here is to just make it so she sees some play on maps other than Icebox, and yes, I understand that if you buff her too much, then she'll see 100% pick rate on Icebox, but I think that that's unavoidable, and it's a shame right now that because the map pool doesn't doesn't line up for her. She's just not seeing any play. The next up is going to be a bit of a controversial one, but I think it's really important that Riot does something to Neon. And the thing specifically about Neon is that she really doesn't see a lot of play. Like 3% pick rate in champions and really low pick rate across the board in most major tournaments. And when we compare that to characters like Raze or characters like Jett, where Jett just went through a major nerf and is still going to see dramatically more play than Neon, it really shows that the way that Jett and Raze take space on point is something that Neon just can't do. And also, Neon is one of the hardest characters to work with the team. While she can be fantastic for ranked as a pub stomper, because of the way that her wall splits down the site, it's a very awkward ability to use for anyone but yourself, and most Neon players will also agree that it's kind of awkward for yourself as well. Like in theory, Neon would be the perfect character to take space on site, but I think some amount of tweaking to some of her major abilities would be needed. Her sprint and slide high gear, overdrive her ultimate, and relay bolt, her concussion blast, are all perfectly fine. I just think that fast lane could be changed to perhaps make it so that if enemies like walk in it, they can't see as well, or maybe they get like slightly electrocuted, or it makes it slightly hard to see and they're taking a little bit of damage or something along those lines. Just don't allow, you know, your team to walk through it and then the enemy to like flash in it and push you, or just peek it and kill you. Or maybe there's like some cackles, like some lightning cackles around the fast lane, to where if it's touching any opponents, it gives you a notification. Like it tells Neon there's an enemy nearby, so that the Neon knows that there's an enemy either on the outside of their wall or the inside of their wall. And that could be really cool for setting up those engage. Like just these little slight things could make Neon a lot better in some of these executes, and it would be a small change to make. But with Neon being so underpicked and underplayed, I think that there is some room to add some of these features that really help for the coordinated aspect of her play, so that she fits better in to a meta. Because honestly, just as a personal preference, I really love watching pro metas that have Neon in them. It's just really cool to watch, and maybe I'm super biased, but that's just my opinion. And the next character that we have on this list is Cypher, a character that is seeing very little play, seeing a tiny bit on split, but outside of that, not much at all. And some people might argue that Cypher is only picked really little because Killjoy is so strong, but even in a world where Killjoy was weaker, Cypher wasn't picking up that pick rate. We just saw an increase in a lot of the other characters like Double Initiator, Double Controller, and I really want to see a world where Cypher shines again. Another character similar to Sage that probably got too good too fast, and it felt like every single patch they just made him weaker and weaker and weaker. And also, as the average player in the community has gotten better, people have gotten better at clearing utility with different abilities, clearing trap wires, playing around these things, you're not getting as much free value on Cypher anymore. Like a super simple trap wire, maybe back in the early stages of Valorant, would get you a ton of value because people wouldn't play around it at all, but these days people do, and I would be okay with Cypher becoming a bigger staple in the meta. Most players would rather have a Cypher meta than a Killjoy meta, and it doesn't have to necessarily be anything huge, but even simple things like making trap wire a little bit cheaper, or perhaps making it so certain types of utility doesn't destroy it as easily. You could up the HP of trapwire, because right now it's at 50 HP, so you could make it a little bit higher, a little bit harder to break. There's a lot of different things that you could do, in my opinion, but I really want to pass the question off to you. How would you buff Cypher to make him good but not giga busted? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, the last but certainly not least character was a hard one to pick, because for the most part, most of these other characters are fairly balanced. There are some characters that of course see very little pro play, like Reyna, but they're really good in ranked play, and I think that that's perfectly fine as their role. It's not like every character needs to be a quote-unquote meta pick, but I would say that Harbor could use some legitimate buffs. If you remember, the intention for Harbor in the first place was to introduce him as the secondary line smoke, right? Because Viper was the only line smoker at the time, making it so she was needed on certain maps like Breeze, and then we had a lot of dome smokers, Astra, Brimstone, Omen. But then when Harbor was released, it was quickly realized that he could not be a solo controller at all, and now he's primarily played in duo controller setups, actually almost always. And I think that you could just buff him to the point where his abilities are strong enough, especially High Tide is strong enough to maybe make it so he could be that solo controller, but then you might make duo controller a bit too broken. So you would have to balance around really strengthening High Tide while maybe weakening his other abilities. And I know that that's kind of a weird thing, but you really want to make it so his site splits are replicative of what Viper can do, or you need to introduce like a real Lion Smoker that can compete with Viper, because that's kind of why Viper is just sitting in a high place in the meta. She has been permanently uncontested, and that is what they've done a really good job, honestly, with the initiator role. Most of the time there's a lot of good ones, so not all of them are popping, but most of them are good and strong. They haven't really done a great job in the controller role, so that's what I would like to see. But I really want to pass the question off to you. Which character would you buff if you had ultimate say in what Riot did? What characters would you buff or nerf tomorrow to make Valorant your perfect game? Let me know in the comments down below. But thank you so much for coming by. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.